What remains of the people next door? Submitted to r/nosleep by KamaciteClover. I've always had a fascination with the lives of those around me. I often had difficulty interacting with others, but I frequently found myself tuning into small segments of their day. Ours have been spent people watching at restaurants or sitting near a group of friends as they enjoy each other's company. Forgive me if this comes off as a bit strange. Ever since my parents went home and left me with this place, I have felt isolated. I think I was always like this. I just didn't notice until I no longer had any distractions. Academics took priority, everything else was an afterthought. Once I was left alone, the fog cleared, my grades began to slip, and I eventually stopped attending class. It was only a matter of time until my parents would get word of what I had done. Their reactions no longer meant much to me, similar to how mine meant to them. Until then, I remained alone within the little skybox that was left to me. Up to this point, I had lived a life in which I found little interest. Feeling unable to correct my path, I became even more absorbed in the affairs of others. Perhaps it was merely due to proximity, or how their lives intruded upon mine, but a subject that captured most of my attention was the interactions of my neighbors. The complex that I lived in was located in a spot just a few blocks away from Crawley Boulevard. Not too long ago, the whole neighborhood had been downtrodden and undesirable. The land, however, had been cheap, and so the developers came in. Those who once inhabited the area were swept away. The echoes of poverty were presented as a watered-down culture that was much more palatable to the privileged individuals that roamed the now bustling Crawley Boulevard. The building in which I lived had once been low-income housing. Instead of tearing it down, developers renovated it in the homogeneous stylings found in trendy artificial neighborhoods. Unbeknownst to my parents, the quality of the renovation was questionable to say the least. The walls were lacking in insulation, and, on occasion, I could overhear my neighbors. Some may have found this troubling, but I welcomed it. I got to be involved in someone else's life, even if it was just a part of the audience. I could make out a man and a woman. A couple, it was fair to assume. I recall the first time I heard an argument. I was browsing the web when I heard muffled cries from across my apartment. I went to grab my headphones, but something inside me caused me to pause. Standing up from my desk, I approached the wall behind my TV. I placed my head against it to listen, trying to make sense out of the noise. The words that I could recognize in the dampened shouting were too far in between to create any coherent conversation. Nonetheless, I soon found myself taking comfort in my unknowing company. Though I rarely could make out the words shared, I understood the content of their conversation through their intonation alone. Apathetic murmurs would be exchanged in the morning as one of them would leave for work. Around 4 in the afternoon, they would return, and an argument would erupt. On some occasions, one would storm out, slamming the door shut. Other days, they would remain silent, not speaking for hours. Then, at night, they would make amends, pledging promises to each other that neither would keep. The cycle would repeat the next day. There were variations from time to time, but nothing that diverged too far from the routine. It became a ritual for me to observe this time loop, take in their story, their emotions, and live vicariously through them. Perhaps it was wrong, but I found myself needing those voices as much as oxygen. The days that they were away felt incredibly long. I would lose sleep worrying whether they had moved or maybe even discovered what I was doing. Once I would hear their door creak open, and their labored footsteps enter the apartment, an immense dread would be lifted off of me. On one such occasion though, they did not return. I did my best to remain calm. Perhaps they were going on the trip? It didn't sound right. I would have picked something up in their conversation. The last time I heard the door shut, it was when they returned home. I never heard it after that. I'm sure I didn't miss it either. Every time it shut, it felt as though my whole apartment shuddered. Intrusive thoughts materialized within my head in quick succession. What if something had happened to them? I should check to make sure everything is fine. What if it is fine and then I have to interact with one of them? They'll realize who's living next door. They'll probably know what I'm doing just by looking at me. My shirt stuck to my sweaty skin as I began to hyperventilate. I looked towards my door. I hadn't been out of the room in weeks. Most of my groceries had been delivered. Despite my fears, curiosity won out. The brass doorknob was cool to the touch. Twisting and pulling it back, it revealed a narrow, white, utilitarian hallway. I stepped out of my apartment. The door slammed gracelessly behind me, echoing throughout the corridor. Only a few steps to my right was the entrance to my neighbor's apartment. 508 sat in black numbers in the center of the oak door. Before I could formulate what I intended to say to them, I found myself knocking on the door. Seconds passed. Nothing. I tried again. Still no response. Something held me there, standing in front of the entrance. I was sure I didn't hear the door open again. They should be inside. They had to be inside. Why weren't they answering? I leaned against the door to listen. I could hear nothing from the other side. I tried the door handle. It was locked. Defeated, I returned to my apartment. Part of me wanted to leave it alone, but I wouldn't be able to sleep, not knowing what happened to the people that had become such an important part of my life. My gaze drifted towards the sliding glass door. Past it was a cramped balcony with a view of another overpriced apartment building. In moments, I was standing upon it, staring in the direction of my neighbor's apartment. Attached to it was an identical platform surrounded by stylized metal railings. Looking closer, I spotted that their sliding door was slightly ajar. I evaluated the distance between the two balconies. I was confident enough I could make the jump. I had to be. Otherwise, I would plummet 5 stories to the pavement. I carefully climbed on top of the railing, balancing myself against the outer wall of the apartment. As I stood upright, I felt vertigo kick in. I knew this was insane, but I was beyond caring. Without further hesitation, I leapt forwards, arms stretched out. I didn't get enough distance on my jump. My right hand managed to latch onto the railing just as I began to descend. I held on desperately as my legs bashed against the side of the platform. I lifted them up and placed my feet underneath the railing. Throwing myself over it, I fell onto the balcony. I wiped the sweat from my brow and stood up, trembling from the adrenaline. The curtains were drawn behind the screen door, obscuring most of the apartment. If they were in there, I had no reasonable explanation for breaking into their home. I had already gone this far. There was no point in worrying over such things. Approaching cautiously, I slid open the door and pushed aside the curtains. The apartment was in a worse state than my own. Clothing was scattered everywhere. A few steps away from the main door, a large section of the hardwood floor was stained a purplish black. I couldn't imagine what would have caused such a thing. On a couch, opposite from a television, sat an open suitcase. It was half packed with necessities. A framed photo sat inside. It displayed a couple, no older than 30. They embraced in front of a forested backdrop. Anyone who saw this would have assumed they were living their happiest lives. I knew otherwise. A blue lanyard attached to a white card sat on the floor in front of it. I knelt down to pick it up. Flipping the card revealed an image of the woman. It was the same person that I saw in the other photo. She held a grim expression. There was some sort of chip embedded in it, but nothing giving away the purpose of the card. K78 sat above the image in bold letters with the word blue beside it, separated by a vertical line. I looked towards the kitchen. On a table sat a half-eaten microwave dinner. Insects were swarming around it. A faucet dripped inconsistently. I placed the lanyard down and walked towards it. Once in front of the sink, I reached out and tightened both of the control valves. I felt a sharp pain in my left index and middle finger. I pulled my hands back. Inspecting them, there seemed to be no wounds. The valve did not have anything protruding from it. I looked down at the sink. Soggy bandages sat covered in blood. Additionally, something had burned a hole through its metal surface in the top right corner. My eyes drifted to the hardwood floor. There was a trail of blood droplets leading from the sink through the living room. I followed it until I stood in front of what appeared to be the bathroom door. It sat slightly open, the light left on inside. Placing a hand on the door, I pushed forward. The hinges creaked. Something stirred from within the bathroom. I stopped, the door blocking most of my view. What I heard next could only be described as something trying to scream, but not having the strength to do so. Instead, only the sickly sound of air escaping through a constricted pathway could be heard. The rungs of a shower curtain scraped as I heard something struggle to get up. I backed away. A shadow blocked out a section of the light coming from underneath the door, accompanied by stumbling footfalls. I took several more steps towards the exit. The bathroom door began to creak open. I turned my attention towards the main door as my hands fumbled with the locks. Whatever it was, it seemed to be choking on liquid as it drew closer behind me. I swung the door open and ran into the hallway, slamming it behind me. I sprinted towards my apartment, fumbling for my keys. I could hear the muffled footsteps approaching. I managed to unlock the door. In a panic, I threw myself inside and locked it behind me, attaching the deadbolt for good measure. Backing way into the living room, I waited. I heard the familiar sound of the door swinging open and slamming. The footfalls followed. They were getting louder, coming closer. The footsteps felt impossibly loud. Then, they stopped. It was quiet for a moment. My door began to shake as something furiously banged against it. I fell back onto the floor as my legs seemed to liquefy in fear. The frequency of the impact steadily increased and became louder each time they made contact. I thought the door was going to cave in until the knocking abruptly stopped. Footsteps trailed off down the hallway, accompanied by an intermittent thumping. Then, silence. I sat there, staring forward in shock. I slowly got to my feet and approached the peephole in the door. Hesitantly, I leaned in to look through it. Nothing was there. I tried to make sense of the experience. As I played through the events in my head, they began to feel plausible. I had broken into someone's home and was chased out by the occupant. I would be lucky if they didn't contact the authorities. Regardless, I remained paranoid the rest of the afternoon, waiting for a knock on my door. In the event that the knock did come, I found myself hoping for it to be the police opposed to whoever I had encountered earlier. Nothing seemed to come of it. I laid still in my bed, staring at the barren white ceiling of my room. I managed to drift into sleep despite the dull ache in my left hand. I awoke the next morning to sounds once again coming from the neighboring apartment. I bolted out of bed and towards my living room to listen. Had everything gone back to normal? A wishful thought. As I leaned in against the wall, I could immediately tell that the voices did not belong to the rightful occupants. The conversation was primarily dominated by one voice. It was cold and authoritative. The other voice was softer and monotone, chiming in occasionally. It sounded as if the entire apartment was being rearranged. I heard the door swing open. A legion of footsteps passed through the hall. I crept towards my door and looked through the peephole. I just caught a figure dressed entirely in black pass by the door towards my neighbor's apartment. Their face was obscured by a gas mask. Another dark figure stepped out into view walking in the other direction, followed by a series of men wearing what looked like bright yellow spacesuits. Each of them carried a strange white cooler littered with symbols. As they did this, the door directly across from mine opened. A wiry man with gray hair leaned out annoyed, as if about to scold someone. His gaze met something out of view by my neighbor's apartment. The expression melted off his face as he stood still. Two men in dark uniforms approached him. One forcibly put a hand on the man's chest and led him back inside. The other one followed directly behind, his hand reaching for something on his side. It was a silenced pistol. His other hand closed the door behind them. A minute passed. No sound came from the apartment. The door opened, and two dark figures walked back out, closing it once again after they exited. My body tensed up. Another yellow suit walked by, trailed by a man dressed in white with a full face visor. That's the last of the samples. What a goddamn mess. He muttered to himself. One of the dark figures began to follow them as they walked out of sight, but the other stopped. He was looking down. His gaze then lifted towards my door. I could not bring myself to blink. My eye was glued to the peephole of my door as he slowly approached it. I saw a glimpse of his cold blue eyes through his mask as he leaned in closer. He reached towards his holster. "We've got the material. Central wants us to clear out ASAP," the authoritative voice stated. The dark figure stepped back and looked to his right. The man in the white suit standing just on the edge of my peephole's view. Through a full face visor, a withered visage frowned in his direction. His presence demanded respect and simultaneously outlined the consequences of disobedience. The dark figure marched off. As he did so, I spotted a strange badge on his shoulder. It looked like an eye with two spears crossing inside its pupil. My vision darted from the badge to the man in white who was still standing there. He was looking directly at the peephole. There was no reaction in his face as he casually walked away. After they had been gone for a bit, I let out an exhale. I nearly collapsed onto the floor. I gripped the doorknob with my left hand, then immediately released it in reaction to a sharp pain. When I looked down, my hand appeared fine. I tested the doorknob. No pain. I twisted it and pulled the door open. I looked upon the entrance of the gray-haired man's home. What did they do? I didn't want to know. It could have been me just as easily. What had caused the man in the black mask to approach my door? I looked down, and my throat tightened. Footprints. There were footprints burned into the carpet leading from my neighbor's to my front door. They were right up against the wall, so I didn't spot them through the looking glass. Inspecting the wall between the neighbor's and my own apartment, there was a burn mark that looked almost like a hand. I turned to glance at my door. A large section of the oak had been eaten away. The footsteps then turned and led down the hallway, accompanied by sporadic marks on walls and doors. I followed the trail until I stood before the complex's elevator. The metal had been melted and warped, leaving a gaping hole in the center of its doors. I rushed back to my apartment. My mind began to spiral into paranoia. Time passed. I began to run out of food, but refused to leave my apartment. My left hand was killing me. It often kept me awake, despite any attempts I made to numb the pain. It continued to become more pronounced until one day, as I was pouring myself a cup of coffee, my hand spasmed. The cup fell to the ground and shattered. A severe burning sensation caused me to slump. It was coming from the middle and index finger of my left hand. I looked down to see 2 black dots, one on the pad of each finger. They began to expand like cigarette burns, the skin peeling back around them. I saw my fingers lose color, and warp into a dark black as if they were frostbitten. My right hand gripped my wrist as I watched this unknown force eat away at the flesh and bone. My 2 fingers were quickly degrading into nubs, their ends spouting a tar-like substance. The corruption was rapidly gaining momentum, about to reach my palm. I rushed over to the kitchen and fished out a dirty knife from the sink. I placed a kitchen cloth in my mouth and bit into it. Throwing my left hand down on the counter, I cleaved off what was left of the fingers at the knuckle. My teeth clenched as blood sprayed from the amputation site. I took the cloth out of my mouth and applied it to the wound. I watched in awe as the dark substance consumed the flesh on the countertop, making a sickly sizzling noise all the while. Once the remains of my fingers had been completely dissolved, the liquid became still. As it initially covered the flesh, it looked almost like grease on a frying pan, or even a bubbling soft drink. Now it just sat dormant on the counter, like a puddle of ink. The sight of it almost made me forget about the throbbing pain of my left hand. Without further hesitation, I rushed towards my bathroom. The cloth had become dripping with red. I stumbled inside and threw the cabinet open. Locating a first aid kit, I sterilized the wound and wrapped it with bandage. My mind and body were in a state of shock over what had just happened. I considered calling an ambulance, getting some sort of help, but my thoughts drifted back to those men. This black puddle that sat on the living room floor, was it somehow part of what they were looking for? I paused for a moment. Wasn't the puddle on the kitchen counter? I stared upon it. I looked back at the kitchen. There was no residue. I had only turned my back on it for a moment. As I observed it, I thought that the puddle, as small as it was becoming shallower. As I continued watching, I realized it was no illusion. The liquid began to spread across the hardwood into a thin layer until it had completely dissipated, leaving behind a purplish black stain, not unlike bruised flesh. I attempted to maintain my faculties, but I had never witnessed such a thing before. Its actions felt deliberate, as if it was moving by its own volition. If that was the case, why move to this part of the apartment just to embed itself into the floor? I almost laughed at this. I was attributing consciousness to a substance. A substance that just burned off 2 of my fingers, I reminded myself. I looked at my hastily bandaged hand. Logic suggested that I should seek medical attention. Fear dictated that I stay inside. I saw what happened to the man in the hallway. The pain had slightly subsided, or I had just gotten used to it, so I figured I could hold out for a bit. Countless hours seemed to pass as I stared at the mark on the floor. I didn't want to take my eyes off it. I couldn't relax with something such as that in my apartment. I did not dare approach it, considering what it had done to my hand. I just watched helplessly from across the room on my couch. I awoke with my head tilted upwards towards the ceiling. I had fallen asleep on the sofa. Something was dripping intermittently. My heart raced as I remembered the events from the previous day. I jolted from my seat, looking towards the spot on the floor. It was no longer there. In its place was a hole roughly twice the surface area of the stain that preceded it. I approached it, eyes locked on it unblinking. As I got closer, something became audible. It could be compared to something sizzling or sloshing about. I stepped closer, what lay beyond the hole slowly came into view. An indescribable scent registered in my brain, making me sick. I peered down to the floor below me. I became rigid. In the apartment beneath me, I looked upon a bed. Someone had been in it. Not much more detail can be conveyed, as the entire room was blanketed in a black tar-like substance moving amongst itself. I stared at the shape of a person protruding from what had once been a bed. My gaze locked on its featureless face. I watched as its head tidled ever so slightly towards me. Its jaw extended, revealing a gaping maw. It wheezed in agony as the entire figure sunk and dissolved into the dark mass that was the room. My mind had all but shut down at this point. Something in my subconscious took over. My legs moved towards the exit of my apartment, through the hallway and down the stairs. In my head, there was only white noise. As I walked through the lobby, I passed a couple complaining about the elevator being out of order. They did not notice the liquid accumulating at the bottom of its doors. I was too far gone to consider warning them at the time. I wish I did. I just kept walking until I ended up here, at the shelter. I didn't use my real name. They probably know exactly where I am, watching me at this very moment. I stay awake at night thinking about that thing within my apartment. The precision in which it picked a spot on my floor and ate towards its prey. Why did it leave me alone? That question was always followed with a more concerning thought. Perhaps, it already had me. I try my best to write this off as paranoia, but every now and then, I feel a strange pulsing where my 2 fingers once were.